This program will involve the observation of an array of prints, and we will be focused only on one thing, and that is the recognition of the arch pattern. All of the fingerprint pattern types are included in this array. It's now time to begin by studying the characteristics of just the arch. When I'm done with this section, you'll be able to select the arches in this array. Before we even begin the exam, I have to mention one very important concept, and that is orientation. Anytime you begin a process of examining something, you must ensure that you're looking at it in the proper orientation. It's probably quite obvious to you that this iris is upside down, and through rotation I can place it in the proper orientation. Now it's ready to be examined. However, the fingerprint here, you may or may not know if it's in proper orientation. By simply rotating it, I can tell you now that it is in proper orientation. In other words, this is how you should look at it when you are making an examination. And you must also always know when it is properly oriented. To make my point a little bit better, if you try to read the text in this box, you'll find it very difficult. We always try to rotate text so that it goes from left to right. This makes it comfortable and prevents eye strain. You know what happens when you have text that's not oriented properly. You'll often have to tilt your head, and this can eventually lead to a sore neck. So I've discussed orientation and how important it is to look at something. Let's see how that relates to fingerprints. Now this is a fingerprint card, and I will orient it properly by rotating it. And the first way that you know orientation is by the text. If you pick up anything, you will usually read it, hold it, and read it so that you're reading left to right. In this case of the fingerprint card, although it does not have the name of the person whose print this is, the text and the placement of the impressions are in proper orientation. In other words, all orientation of fingerprints is based on how they are placed on the fingerprint card. And I'm going to just discuss the inked fingerprint impressions in this tutorial. One other thing, I will always display fingerprints in the proper orientation in this tutorial until you can get a better reference of how fingerprints should be oriented. I'll make sure that they're always placed properly. I'm going to explain the arch pattern with a sketch that I drew. Here I'm displaying how ridges are beginning on one end, rising, making a hill, and the prints lower to the other side at approximately the same level. I like to explain to people that the arch, if you have a proper imagination, you can visualize riding your bike from left to right without getting a flat tire. This is the only fingerprint pattern that you can do that. All of the ridges are going from one side to the other. I'd like to further explain that concept by simply outlining some ridges. I will start on the left and follow along the ridge. It is rising, it is forming a hill, and it is returning to the same side. The ridges start on the left, rise, reach a hill, and return to the same side. Let's try one more towards the lower section. They start on one side and go all the way across. So now we're already understanding that what is happening in this first joint of the finger the pattern is rising on one side and returning to the other. This area here is the crease, or the area where the first joint and the second joint are together. And what we're looking at, what we're most concerned with, however, is the ridges in the pattern area of the print, and that would be these ridges that rise and return. And very important to recognize is how the ridges start on one side and pretty much end on the other side in a straight line. And so I can draw lines across, and this illustrates very well how the plane arch, the ridges travel. Let's look one more time at the plane arch pattern, and I have put a red box around this one so that we'll know later when we're looking at that. Again, one last time, the ridges start on one side, rise, and return to the other side. Now I'm going to use this print that I've put the red box around. I'm going to use it as an exemplar, or it is the example that I will use for the plane arch pattern. And I now want you to examine these other prints and recognize how generally the pattern flows in the same direction. In other words, if we did the road test, the bike could travel starting on one side, rising and returning to the other side. In each one of these, this print here is a little bit different in that it rises a little bit more abruptly than these do. Despite that very slight variation, all of these patterns have the same flow. Before we proceed to some fingerprint comparison, let's review the definition of the arch. And this is from the science of fingerprints. A fingerprint pattern in which the ridges enter on one side of the impression and flow, or tend to flow, out the other side with a rise or wave in the center. The science of fingerprints also says the plane arch is the most simple of all fingerprint patterns, and it is easily distinguished. And that's part of the reason that I selected the arch to be the first pattern that we learn. Now I'll just review a definition from Fingerprint Discoveries, and here I'm using an analogy to explain what the plane arch looks like. And the arch is a fingerprint pattern in which the friction ridges rise in the center like a hill and return. You could safely ride a bike across it without getting a flat tire. Let's test your ability to recognize a plane arch pattern by using both the exemplar on the left and the analogy that I gave you on the right. I'm just going to fly prints in and give you a second to make a determination, and then I'll proceed. The first print, is that a plane arch pattern? The ridges are rising, but are they returning to the other side? Another print. The ridges are rising and returning, but what is happening in this region right here? Is that a plane arch pattern? What about this one? The ridges are rising, forming a hill, and returning to the other side. What about this one? The ridges are rising very abruptly, and there is other things going on with that. hope you see the total dissimilarity between these. What about that one? What about this one? What about that one? I can even put it next to it. I'm hoping you're seeing great dissimilarity there. What about this one? You may see more than just common ridge flows in this one. What about this? What about that one? Here I'm going to warn you that the ridges are rising, but again, there's something going on right here that is completely dissimilar to what we see here. Now we're just looking at the pattern flow, or the way the ridges are running. What about this one? What about this one? Let's just do something here. And, you know, if that's all you had, you may be thinking that that's a plain arch, correct? But that's not all we have. Here I want you to focus in the very center. What about this one? The ridges are rising and returning. The ridges on this side, however, are rising, and they're doing something else. Notice how much faster these are rising than these are. Is that an arch pattern? You need to be looking very carefully right here in the center. Again, because if I take away some of that, now it's starting to look like a plain arch. And that's why you have to have the entire pattern area to determine the pattern type. Let's take it back down. What about this one? This one is rising, but it's making a rather abrupt rise in this region and returning. And it is, however, coming down about to the same level as it began. But hopefully you're seeing this area here to be very different than the plain arch pattern. What about this one? I may be going too slow or too fast for some of you, and you can always pause the scrubber. What about this one? What about that print? Let's bring this one in. Hopefully you're seeing great dissimilarity between these. In some ways you could say they're almost opposite. And this simply is a process where you're using the exemplar and the analogy to determine an exclusion. If the pattern looks consistently different than the analogy or the exemplar, you can make an exclusion. You may not know what the other print classification is, but you can determine that it is not a plain arch. And this is a great way for you to build up your visual reference file on what patterns look like. And again, these are all in the proper orientation for comparison. What about that one? You may have questions on that one. You shouldn't have a question on this one. What about this? Got a little white spot here, but that shouldn't matter. What about that one? I can almost do a superimposition. I hope you concluded that that's a plain arch. And that one. Let's review what we did in this first section of the tutorial. We used an exemplar, which I designated as an arch, and we also used an analogy that described what the pattern looks like using the road test. Then we compared a complete array of other fingerprint pattern types, and you got the opportunity to try to recognize plain arch patterns using the exemplar and the analogy. You are now ready to get your plain arch pattern study guide, and then you will be taking your first quiz. In the quiz, you're going to recognize only plain arches, and you will have to select the plain arches that exist in this array of 50 patterns. You will mark an A on top of the pattern that you recognize to be a plain arch. When that is all done, and before you proceed with the next pattern, you will watch another video and I will explain which of the patterns below are plain arches before you proceed.